Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace.
And something a little bit different today, thanks to the fact that you lot continue to watch my videos, which I deeply appreciate. That's meant I've been able to help support the Armoured Carriers website, which also runs through Squarespace. So if you haven't been to visit that site, you really should. Jamie runs an absolutely fantastic site, massive amounts of detail about the operation of carriers, and as you can see, he's a much better web designer than me. He's got everything filed in nice hierarchical structures, very easy to understand. You can see what's links, what's documents, what's pages. All of this, obviously, organization is possible within the website section of Squarespace. You've also got analytics, which is actually useful to show you because there actually are some analytics for this website as opposed to the occasional visitor to mine. And so you can see how useful this tool is. It shows you day to day how many visitors you're getting, what kind of devices they're using, where they're coming from. Are they Googling you? Are they coming from a direct link from a specific website, and so on and so forth. So if you want to know what a professional looking website built in Squarespace looks like, well, look no further. This is the kind of thing you can pull off with just one person's efforts.
So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show.
The Naval Act of 1794, drafted in response to the actions of the Barbary pirates, had provided the US Navy with its famous 6 frigates: President, Constitution, United States, Congress, Constellation, and Chesapeake. These had formed the core of the US Navy in the last years of the 18th century and now into the early 19th. Other small warships would be acquired here and there over the subsequent years, but at the start of the quasi-war with France, those 6 frigates were still under construction or fitting out. Constellation, United States, and Constitution were due to be ready by the summer of 1798, but this left a period of over a year where French warships were capable of taking American merchantmen, and there wasn't really a huge amount that the United States could do about that. This had led regular people to start construction of their own warships by subscription for use by the US Navy. These days we would call that crowdfunding a warship. Strictly speaking, of course, there was nothing in law at the time stopping a random group of private citizens from just building and arming their own frontline warship, but the costs of crewing one, supplying it, and coordinating its actions with other vessels meant that handing them over to the US Navy was seen as preferable. Of course, there needed to be some formal mechanism of transfer, otherwise every warship being built at various yards in the United States would end up having its own bespoke deal with varying terms, and that of course would lead to inevitable arguments if someone got a better deal than somebody else. This led to the Act of June the 30th, 1798, which authorised the US government to accept any such privately built warships in exchange for what we would today call financial securities, at the time called government certificates, which gave the people in question a 6% interest on the cost of the vessel in question unless and until it was bought out fully. This eventually resulted in at least 10 ships entering service, 5 sloops, 1 ship, the John Adams, that vacillated back and forth between being a sloop and a frigate, and 4 full-sized frigates, the Philadelphia, which would later be lost in the Barbary Wars, the New York, the Boston, and the Essex, the last of which is the relevant ship for today. Essex and Boston were on the smaller side when it came to frigates, displacing a little bit under 1,000 tons compared to New York and Philadelphia, which were both well clear of that number. And she was so named because her purchase had been funded by the people of Essex County, Massachusetts, which included the town, now city, of Salem. She was built in Salem starting in 1798, and would enter service with the US Navy at the end of 1799. As a smaller fifth-rate frigate entering a world where, given that it was the quasi-war, the typical French equivalent was a nominally 38 or 40 gun vessel that was considerably larger, and there was the off chance of running into one of the much larger French 24-pounder frigates, of which 3 classes were in service at the time, and some of which were notionally 50-gunners, it was decided that, well, since most frigate actions rather quickly devolved into close-range slugging matches, the ship should take on a rather unusual armament for the time, being almost entirely equipped with short-range 32-pounder carronades, both on the main gun deck as well as their more traditional place on the upper gun deck or spar deck, with a handful of small long guns provided for chase guns and so forth. Just over a decade later, and with a new war with the British having broken out, Essex sailed almost immediately, making a successful voyage, taking numerous prizes under Captain David Porter. In the closing months of 1812, she'd sail once more, gradually working her way south across the Atlantic and then into the Pacific, where she promptly set about decimating the British whaling fleet, which operated in the southeastern Pacific, alongside a captured whaler, the Atlantic, which she had taken and then converted into an auxiliary warship which was renamed Essex Junior. The latter half of the 1813 was somewhat confusingly spent getting distracted by becoming involved in a tribal war in Polynesia, where Porter hoped to establish a naval base, and more immediately reorganise his growing fleet of captured whalers. By the end of the year, though, Essex and Essex Junior had left that campaign ashore and sailed over to Valparaiso in Chile, which was a neutral port, in order for rest, resupply, and intelligence, hoping to capture one or more of the small number of British ships in the area. Just less than a month later, having heard about the Americans' arrival, the 36-gun frigate HMS Phoebe arrived, along with the sloop HMS Cherub, nominally of 18 guns. Of course, as you might expect for this conflict, if you've been following this series so far, no one was actually carrying their rated armament. Essex was actually carrying 46 guns rather than 32 or 36. 40 of them were 32-pounder carronades and the other 6 were long 12-pounder cannon. Phoebe was also carrying 46 guns as opposed to her rated 36, and in her case this consisted of 26 18-pounder long guns, 10 9-pounder long guns, and 10 32-pounder carronades. This gave Essex an almost 50% firepower advantage at close range, but essentially negligible firepower outside of this band. Cherub was carrying 26 guns to the Essex Junior's 20, and here the firepower difference was even more considerable, but this time in favour of the British. Cherub was armed almost like Essex in miniature, with 16 32-pounder carronades, 8 12-pounder carronades, and only 2 long guns, both very small 6-pounders, whilst Essex Junior carried 10 18-pounder carronades and 10 6-pounder long guns. It's worth noting at this point that Porter had repeatedly raised issues with Essex's armament before he'd set sail over a year earlier, wanting at least some of his guns replaced by weapons capable of reaching out to reasonable distances, but all of this had ultimately come to nothing. When the British ships first appeared, a portion of the US ships' crews were ashore. These were quickly summoned back, and so Essex was actually fully crewed by the time the British warships entered the harbour. Captain Hillier, in command of the Phoebe, first tried to provoke a battle, assuming the Americans wouldn't be prepared and thus would be perhaps nervous or intimidated. Phoebe and Cherub sailed in either side of the anchored Essex at extremely close range and at a fair old speed. The idea was to provoke the presumably panicking American crew into firing on them under the assumption that they were about to be attacked. Being then able to point to the Americans having broken the provisions of neutrality first, the British ships could then be free to open up with full broadsides and take the Essex in short order. However, Porter rallied his men, and as Phoebe passed alongside, it was pretty clear that Essex was fully manned, fully cleared for action, and ready for anything. With the crew operating in a disciplined manner, there was absolutely no chance of getting them to let go with an accidental or panic discharge, and in any case, a boarding distance gunfight was perfect engagement range for the Essex, with her crew ready, and so the British ships, unable to break with the provisions of neutrality themselves, simply continued to sail on past and anchored about half a mile astern. Hillier now decided he would blockade the Americans, which led to over a month of on-again, off-again passive aggression. Essex flew a large banner with free trade and sailors' rights emblazoned on it. Phoebe responded with the somewhat less catchy God and country, British sailors' best rights, traitors offend both. Contained within the latter was also a veiled threat. While Porter and the majority of his crew, which included a young boy who would one day become Admiral Farragut, could expect all the regular courtesies of war if captured, there was a small number of men serving in the US Navy who were either British subjects or had deserted from British ships, much as there was also a small number of Americans serving on Royal Navy vessels. If Essex was taken, then the deserters, if any happened to be aboard, could expect a rapid execution if found. Porter also issued a series of challenges and made a few faked attempts at getting underway, trying to dummy the British, but at the same time, semi-cordial negotiations were going on ashore, with both sides agreeing to an exchange of a number of prisoners taken from other ships, on the condition that those who had been released would not fight in what was sure to become the shortly upcoming battle. By mid-February, Phoebe and Cherub were patrolling offshore instead of laying in the harbour. They'd replenished themselves and they could continue to receive supplies from ashore via British merchant vessels, who could now sail to and fro from the harbour, knowing that any move by Porter to try and capture them would in turn allow the American ships to be attacked. This measure was partially undertaken to give Hillier more room to manoeuvre. As mentioned earlier, a close-range fight wasn't exactly in his interests, but also partially because although the various stunts by Porter, such as burning a prize on the edge of the range of the Chilean shore guns, the traditional interpretation of the limits of territorial waters at the time, were wearing the patience of the Chilean governor with the Americans rather thin, there was also the matter of the rules of neutrality, which required that if an opposing warship found itself in the same harbour as a ship of the other side, then if one of them sailed, the other had to wait 24 hours before setting off in pursuit. As February turned into March, things began to escalate. Some rumours suggested that one or more of the big American frigates had made sail from the US coast back in December, and one or more of them might be headed down to rescue Porter. More proximately, and somewhat more concrete though, was definitive news of the approach of HMS Tagus and HMS Britain. HMS Tagus was a newly commissioned mid-sized fifth-rate constructed the previous year in a rush out of Pine as part of a crash program of ship construction. She was only expected to last a few years in service, while Britain was a big Leda-class fifth-rate and a sister to the Shannon. Even if the rumours of one of the big American frigates being on their way were true, and as it turned out in the end they weren't, the two British ships would bring Hillier up to 4 ships much sooner. Porter realised if he was going to do anything, it had to be sooner rather than later, and so he resolved a plan. Phoebe was designed for speed, and he couldn't assume that he'd be able to outrun her, but Essex Jr., being an ex-whaler, was considerably slower than any of the other true warships involved. And so he began a series of deceptions, with the aim of getting a lead on the British in the Essex, drawing them away, and then either losing them in the open seas or forcing a close-range battle, either of which would allow Essex Jr. to escape unseen and unharassed. Thus, on the 27th of March, he made efforts to make it seem like his ships would be at anchor for quite some time to come, sending the purser ashore to make provision for later purchases of food and other items, and making sure that known British agents saw this. Then, after dark, he sent a boat loaded with lights and rockets out to sea, the idea of this being to lure the British into investigating and thus pulling them out of position. Didn't have to be by much, just far enough that, in order for them to turn round across the wind, would rob them of the time and speed that they needed to catch Essex before she slipped past and made for the open seas. This latter effort sort of worked. The British did indeed go to investigate, but upon finding nothing, Hillier was able to resume station before dawn. Porter may therefore have wished to actually stay in harbour a bit longer and try some other distraction methods, but in the early afternoon of the 28th, the wind rapidly began to rise in strength. One of Essex's anchor cables parted under the strain, and the other one was making ominous creaking noises. Porter decided to make the best of a bad situation, cut the remaining cable, and lunge out to sea. Both sides hoisted their banners, ensigns, and other flags again, with some additional mottos which had been created in the intervening weeks. But the squall that Essex had ridden off of her anchor point turned out to be just the first of many. As she rounded the point of the harbour, trying to get the weather gauge on the British ships, another squall blew in, this one even more violent and from a slightly different direction. Essex was almost stood on her ends, and one sailor noted the spar deck was dipping into the sea. Luckily, at this point, the main gun ports were shut, otherwise the whole thing would have ended there and then in a reenactment of the Mary Rose's sinking. But, just at this point, the main topmast collapsed, taking with it 2 sailors. As the squall blew itself out and the ship righted itself, it was very clear that any attempt to run was going to be futile. With the mainmast rigging in partial disarray and the largest topsail gone, there was no chance of Essex outrunning anything more than a garbage scow, and with the British bearing down, there wasn't even time for improvised repairs to the main mast's rigging. Cutting away all loose sails and rigging, Porter judged that a return to his former position was also impossible, and instead he made for another small bay in the overall harbour, hoping, if nothing else, to force an engagement on one side of his ship instead of being doubled. But this bay was several miles from the port, and as far as any reports were concerned, any Chilean fortifications, which of course in the parlance of the time meant it was now in international waters. Essex dropped anchor only 25 yards from the shore, a rather remarkable feat of seamanship, and that at least meant that the objective to force a fight from one side of the ship had been met. But, with the ship cornered and now stationary, the initiative lay entirely with Captain Hillier. He resolved to have Cherub bombard the American ship's bow, while he took Phoebe in to deliver raking broadsides to the stern. But the continuing squalls made this kind of fine manoeuvring so close to shore quite dangerous, and so Phoebe settled instead off Essex's starboard aft quarter, still out of the arc of any of Essex's starboard main battery. The 2 British ships now commenced a steady demolishing fire, aiming primarily to disable the ship's guns and crew on the upper deck. A miss low would hit the main gun deck, and a miss high would damage the sails, masts and rigging, so it was all a win. Essex, able to return fire only with her half-dozen 12-pounder long guns, brought them all over to the engaged side and split them evenly fore and aft, the forward guns managing to keep up a rapid and accurate fire on the Cherub, which was sufficient that the sloop decided to remove itself from there and shadow Phoebe instead. The battle was taking place well inside the range of the long guns aboard Phoebe, but it was also just about inside the range of Essex's carronades. It had to be if you wanted Cherub to be even moderately effective, albeit the energy of carronade rounds would be almost completely spent at this distance, and that was assuming that Essex could bring her own broadside to bear. In aid of this, Porter repeatedly ordered spring lines attached to the anchor cable so that the ship could be hauled around, but each time they tried, British fire shot away the lines. What return fire Essex could manage was aimed primarily at her enemy's rigging. If Porter could shoot away enough of it, then either escape might still be possible, or potentially the enemy ships might lose enough control to be blown ashore in the next squall and wrecked. The vagaries of wind and tide meant that occasionally all the ships would swing around and the American carronades got off a salvo or 2, and enough of these persuaded Hillier to try and switch tactics. He pulled away to fix the mess that the Americans were making of his rigging, and then he bore back in, advising Cherub to keep herself underway and take shots of opportunity. Meanwhile, Phoebe would nudge her way back into the starboard aft quarter blind spot, but would finish up somewhat further out, beyond carronade range entirely, and swapped broadsides for a steady, deliberate and aimed fire from her 18-pounders. Phoebe was, however, still working her way toward a favoured anchoring position when the wind shifted again, and Essex made one last attempt at evening the playing field, cutting loose her cables and setting all sail, trying to sweep down on the incoming Phoebe. But as fast as the wind rose, it died away, which left Essex gently adrift amidst a hail of incoming fire. More and more of the ship's guns and gun crews were being knocked out, and then a pile of powder charges stacked near a hatchway was hit and caught fire, exploding with enough force to blow some men clean over the side and persuade others that the ship was surely doomed, leading to them jumping off and attempting the short swim to land. Porter recognised the fight was well and truly lost and now moved to denying the enemy a prize. He ordered Essex to be run ashore and then blown up, but not enough unwounded men and intact sails remained to accomplish this. And so instead he ordered those that could to swim for shore or take what boats remained, and then at some point between 6 and 6:30 in the evening, depending on which ship's log you believe, because all their chronometers had drifted, Essex struck her colours. Of her 255-man crew, she had 58 dead, 66 wounded, and 31 missing in action over the side, plus another 24 who had made it ashore in a somewhat more controlled manner. Of the 76 men left aboard, most were lightly injured in some way, shape or form. By contrast, the British had a total of 5 killed and 10 wounded, split between the two ships, with the majority being on Phoebe. Thanks to the large number of flags that both sides were flying, it actually took the British around 10 minutes to even realise the American flag had been lowered. Hillier wrote after the battle, "The defence of the Essex, taking into consideration our superiority of force and the very discouraging circumstances of her having lost her main topmast and being twice on fire, did honour to her brave defenders, and most fully evinced the courage of Captain Porter and those under his command. Her colours were not struck until the losses in killed and wounded was so awfully great and her shattered condition so seriously bad as to render all further resistance unavailing." Essex Jr. had stood by as a spectator and was now rather easily persuaded to surrender by overwhelming force. She would be disarmed and sent on to New York as a prisoner cartel, and ended up actually being fired upon by New York shore batteries for her troubles, although they all missed. Over the next few weeks, Hillier did his best to patch up Essex and make good Phoebe's own damage, in the course of which Britain and Tagus arrived. On the 31st of May, Phoebe and her prize made sail for the UK, leaving Cherub with the other 2 frigates to secure the Southeast Pacific. After judgment by the prize court, Essex would be brought into the Royal Navy as HMS Essex, whilst Phoebe would return to the Pacific, recapturing one of the whalers that Essex had taken earlier. 2 more frigate duels remained in the War of 1812, and one of those actually took place just a little bit after the war's official end, thanks to the slow speed of communications at the time. Next month, we'll look at the one that actually took place before the conclusion of hostilities. That would be the duel between USS President and HMS Endymion.